The moment a waitress stopped a $100 million deal, no one saw it coming. Your translator is lying. The words hit the table like a gunshot. Conversations froze. Crystal glasses paused midair. Every head turned at once. Emily Hayes felt her stomach drop the second she realized she had actually said it. Out loud. Just seconds ago, the private dining room on the top floor of a Manhattan high-rise had been glowing with quiet luxury. Soft amber lights. Low piano music. The kind of place where billion-dollar decisions were made between courses. Now, silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Focused entirely on her. She stood there in a simple black apron, a tray still pressed against her hip, suddenly aware of everything. She wasn't supposed to be in that room. Not important. Not powerful. Not even supposed to speak. Just a waitress. Asterisk, you serve. You don't think so. Asterisk, her manager's voice echoed in her head, sharp and cold. But Emily had been thinking. She couldn't help it. Languages had always worked differently in her mind. She didn't just hear words. She heard intention. Tone. The subtle shifts most people missed. And tonight, something was off. She had noticed it while refilling water at table 12, the table everyone in the restaurant knew not to disturb. Reserved for Daniel Carter. The Daniel Carter. Billionaire CEO. Self-made. Ruthless when he needed to be. The kind of man adjusted their posture around without even realizing it. And tonight, he was about to sign a deal rumored to be worth over $100 million. Emily hadn't meant to listen. She never did. But the moment the translator began speaking, something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not enough for anyone without training to question it. But enough. Enough to twist meaning. Enough to turn caution into agreement. Enough to turn a partnership into a trap. Her grip tightened around the tray as she walked away, her pulse beginning to spike. This wasn't her world. If she stayed quiet, everything would go on like normal. She'd finish her shift, count her tips, go back to her tiny apartment where the heater barely worked and the bills stacked higher every month. That was her life. Safe, predictable, invisible. But if she spoke, she could lose everything. Her job, her only steady income, the fragile stability she had fought so hard to rebuild. She stopped near the service station, her breathing uneven now. Her fingers brushed against the small notebook tucked into her apron pocket. Worn pages, scribbled translations, notes from a life she never got to finish, a degree she had to walk away from, tuition she couldn't afford, a future that slipped through her fingers quietly, without warning. Her chest tightened, because now, standing there, she realized something worse than losing her job. If she said nothing, that man, Daniel Carter, was about to sign something he didn't fully understand. $100 million. Gone. And she would know she could have stopped it. That thought hit harder than fear. Before she could talk herself out of it, she turned. Fast. Back toward the table. The translator was mid-sentence. The investor nodding calmly. Daniel watching everything with that same controlled, unreadable expression. Emily didn't think anymore. Didn't hesitate. Didn't stop. Your translator is lying. This time, she meant every word. For a split second, no one moved. The investor's polite smile froze. The translator went completely silent. Even the soft piano music in the background suddenly felt too loud, like it didn't belong in this moment anymore. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What did I just do? Every instinct screamed at her to step back. Apologize. Disappear. Pretend it never happened. Go back to being invisible. But it was too late. The words were already out there. And now, they had weight. Slowly, Daniel Carter turned his head toward her. Not rushed. Not surprised. Controlled. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes locked onto hers with sharp, unsettling focus. The kind of look that made everything else in the room disappear. What did you just say? His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the tray. I said, she hesitated for half a heartbeat, then steadied herself. He's not translating it correctly. A small pause. Then, a quiet chuckle. The translator leaned back slightly in his chair, shaking his head with a thin, controlled smile. That's a very serious accusation, he said smoothly. I've been doing this for over 15 years. There it was. Confidence. Authority. Experience. Everything Emily didn't have. Around the table, subtle glances were exchanged. Doubt. Irritation. Curiosity. Near the bar, her manager had already started walking toward them, fast. This was about to get ugly. But Daniel didn't look at anyone else. Not the translator. Not the investor. Not the manager closing in. Just Emily. Then explain, he said calmly. What's wrong? The room seemed to tighten around her. This was it. No going back. Emily took a breath. Focused. Listened. The investor didn't agree to full exclusivity, she said, her voice steadier now. He said he'd consider a limited partnership, under specific conditions. A beat. That's not the same thing. The foreign investor shifted in his seat, his brows pulling together. He turned sharply toward the translator, speaking in his native language. Faster now, more direct. The translator responded immediately. Too quickly. Too smoothly. But Emily heard it. Every word. Every subtle change. Every slight distortion. Her pulse spiked. He was doing it again. Daniel's gaze flicked between them, then back to Emily. Say it again, he said. This time, there was no hesitation in his voice. Translate exactly what he just said. Emily nodded once. No fear now. Just clarity. She repeated the investor's words. Precise, clean, undeniable. Sentence by sentence. The room went quiet again. But this silence felt different. Heavier. Sharper. As she spoke, the investor's expression changed. Confusion, then recognition. Then something else. Relief. He nodded. Once. Then again. And this time, when he spoke, he slowed down. Deliberate. Careful. Testing her. Emily didn't miss a single word. She translated everything. Perfectly. No distortion. No hesitation. Just truth. When she finished, no one spoke. The tension snapped. The translator shifted in his seat, his confidence cracking just enough to notice. Perhaps, he said quickly, forcing a tight smile. There was a minor misunderstanding. I don't like being misled. Daniel's voice cut through him. Clean. Final. The translator went quiet. Completely. Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving Emily. But this time, he wasn't looking at her like a waitress. He was studying her, reevaluating, as if something about her didn't fit the role she was standing in. What's your name? He asked. The question caught her off guard. For a moment, Emily hesitated. Because suddenly, this wasn't about the translation anymore. It was about her. Emily Hayes, she said softly. Daniel nodded once. Slow. Deliberate. Emily Hayes, he repeated, like he was committing it to memory. A brief silence followed. Then, you're not leaving just yet. The room didn't go back to normal. It couldn't. Something had shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. Control had changed hands, and everyone felt it. Emily stood exactly where she was, Daniel Carter's words still echoing in her mind. You're not leaving just yet. Her manager had stopped a few steps away, frozen between two bad choices. Drag her out and risk making things worse, or stay quiet and pretend this was somehow acceptable. Emily slowly set her tray down. Her hands weren't steady anymore. Then she stepped forward. One step, then another. Every movement felt heavier than it should. Every second stretched. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting loosely against the table, his attention locked entirely on her now. No documents. No investor. Just her. Sit. One word. No room to refuse. Emily hesitated, just for a second, glancing at her manager. He gave a tight nod. Not permission. Fear. She sat. The chair felt wrong beneath her. Too soft. Too expensive. Like she had stepped into a life that didn't belong to her. Across the table, the translator adjusted his tie, rebuilding his composure piece by piece. But the crack was still there. If we're allowing interruptions, he said smoothly, perhaps we should also verify qualifications. There it was. A quiet attack. Emily felt it land, but before she could react, we will. Daniel cut in. Calm. Flat. Final. He didn't even look at the translator. Then, to Emily. You said the deal was misrepresented. A pause. I want you to walk me through it. From the beginning. The room tightened again. Emily took a breath. This part. This she understood. Words. Meaning. Truth. He said he's open to a limited partnership, she began, her voice steadying. One that allows collaboration, but doesn't restrict future agreements. A beat. But that's not how it was translated. The investor leaned forward slightly now, listening more carefully. Emily continued. Sentence by sentence. Breaking it down. Rebuilding the meaning that had been twisted minutes earlier. The investor spoke again, slower this time. Testing her. Emily translated instantly. Clean. Precise. Exact. Not just the words. The intent. Daniel didn't interrupt. Didn't question. He just listened. But once, when the translator tried to step in, Daniel raised his hand. Didn't even look at him. And that was enough. Silence. Continue, Daniel said. Emily did. By the time she finished, the entire structure of the deal had shifted. What had been a trap was now an opportunity. The investor leaned back, exhaling slightly. That is correct, he said in English. And just like that, the truth had weight. Real weight. Across the table, the translator went still. Daniel finally turned to him. His gaze cold now. Measured. 15 years, he repeated. A pause. And you still chose interpretation over accuracy. The translator opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He had lost the room. Completely. Daniel didn't press further. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked back at Emily. But this time, he wasn't seeing a waitress. He was reassessing an asset. You said you're a waitress, he said slowly. A beat. That's not what you are. Emily didn't answer. Because she didn't know how to. And maybe, she didn't know anymore. Then Daniel made his decision. You're finishing this negotiation. A pause. With me. For a second, the world tilted. Emily felt it. Not physically, but inside. Finish this negotiation. With him. Doubt came rushing back instantly. Sharp. Familiar. You don't belong here. You're going to mess this up. This isn't your world. But then, she looked at the investor. Watching her now. Carefully. Not dismissive. Not amused. Respectful. Then the documents. The deal. The structure. And something inside her clicked. This wasn't about power. Or money. Or status. This was still the same thing it had always been. Language. Meaning. Truth. And that. She understood. Emily straightened slightly in her chair. Her hands relaxed on the table now. No more gripping. No more hesitation. All right, she said. Quiet. But certain. Daniel gave a small nod. Approval. Then turned back to the investor. A simple gesture. Continue. The negotiation resumed. But everything was different now. Every word passed through Emily. Every sentence filtered. Refined. Corrected. The investor spoke. Measured. Deliberate. Emily matched him perfectly. Tone. Timing. Intent. Nothing lost. Nothing added. Just clarity. Daniel listened differently too. Sharper. Faster. More precise. He asked better questions now. Made cleaner decisions. Across the table, the translator had disappeared without moving. Still sitting there. But irrelevant. Completely. Time started to blur. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Emily stopped tracking it. She was locked in. Catching every shift. Every nuance. Every hidden meaning between the lines. At one point, the investor paused. Looked directly at her. A faint smile. Acknowledgement. Respect. Emily returned a small nod. Then continued. No hesitation. No fear. Just control. Daniel leaned back slightly, watching her again. But this time, there was no doubt in his eyes. Only calculation. Reevaluation. Like he was rewriting something in his mind. About her. About this situation. About what came next. Then, the turning point. The investor placed his hand flat on the table. Spoke at length. Firm. Clear. Final. Emily listened. Every word. Then translated. Perfectly. He agrees to proceed with a limited partnership under the revised terms, with an option to expand after 12 months based on performance. Silence. Then, understanding. Daniel studied him for a moment. Then nodded once. Decisive. That works. He extended his hand. The investor took it. A firm handshake. Clean. Final. $100 million. Secured. Not through power, but through precision. Emily exhaled slowly. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. The tension in her shoulders began to fade, but not for long. Stay. Daniel's voice again. Quieter this time. Not an order. Something else. Intent. Emily looked at him. And for the first time that night, she understood. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The handshake lasted just a fraction longer than usual. Not hesitation. Recognition. Something had just changed, and everyone at the table knew it. The investor leaned back with a satisfied nod, already signaling to his assistant. Papers would follow. Lawyers would finalize. Outside their table, the restaurant slowly came back to life. Glasses clinked again. Conversations resumed. Like the world had been paused and was now catching up. But for Emily, nothing moved. Her heart was still racing, trying to catch up to what had just happened. An hour ago, she had been balancing plates, counting tips in her head. Now, she had just helped secure a $100 million deal. The number didn't even feel real. Instinct kicked in. She reached for her tray. Time to leave. Time to disappear. Back to where she belonged. I said stay. Daniel's voice stopped her. Quiet, but absolute. Emily's fingers paused against the edge of the table. Slowly, she pulled her hand back and stayed. Around them, the staff moved again, but differently now. More careful, more aware. Her manager stood near the bar, watching closely, his expression tight, uncertain, calculating. Daniel turned briefly to finish a few final remarks with the investor, but part of his attention never left her. Like he was making sure she didn't disappear. When the investor finally stood to leave, he paused in front of Emily. This time, there was no confusion in his expression, only respect. You have a remarkable ear, he said, slower now, deliberate. Emily nodded slightly. Thank you. The words felt small compared to the moment, but they were all she had. When the investor walked away, the space shifted again. Quieter. Closer. Now it was just them. Daniel leaned back, studying her. Not casually. Not politely. Intentionally. Without the negotiation between them, the silence felt different. More personal. Where did you learn that? He asked. His voice had changed. Less command. More focus. Emily glanced down briefly, her fingers brushing the edge of her apron. Her notebook was still there. Always there. College, she said. A small pause. I studied linguistics. Translation. Then, quieter, for a while. Daniel caught it instantly. For a while, he repeated. A beat. You stopped. Not a question. A conclusion. Emily nodded. I couldn't afford to finish. Simple words. Heavy meaning. Daniel didn't respond right away. No sympathy. No softening. Just observation. The same way he had listened during the deal. Processing. Calculating. Then he leaned forward slightly, closing the distance. You understood a multi-million-dollar contract better than someone with 15 years of experience, he said. His tone was calm, but precise. And you did it without hesitation. Emily swallowed. Because that wasn't how it had felt. It hadn't been confidence. It had been pressure. Necessity. I just heard what he meant, she said quietly. Daniel held her gaze. Longer this time. Like he was testing something. No, he said. Soft. Certain. You did more than that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the restaurant had returned. Soft laughter, the clinking of glasses, low conversations weaving together. But around their table, it all felt distant. Muted. Like they were sitting inside a space that didn't quite belong to the rest of the room. Emily became suddenly aware of everything. The weight of the tray still in her hands. The way her uniform didn't match the room. The subtle difference between her and everyone else here. She set the tray down slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might break whatever this moment was. I was just doing my job, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they didn't sound convincing. Daniel tilted his head slightly, not disagreeing, but not accepting it either. No, he said, calm, measured. You were doing more than what was expected of you. A pause. And you knew it. Emily looked away. Because that part was true. And that truth was uncomfortable. I didn't think about it, she admitted quietly. I just heard it wrong. And I couldn't ignore it. Daniel watched her closely. There was something different in his expression now. Less evaluation. More interest. Most people would have ignored it, he said. Especially in your position. That word again. Position. Emily felt it land heavier this time. She glanced down at her apron, at her hands, at the small details that defined exactly where she stood in this world. I don't usually do that, she said. Another pause. I don't usually speak up. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her. Then why tonight? The question stayed in the air longer than expected. Because Emily didn't have a simple answer. Her mind searched for something clean, something logical. But what came up instead was something else. A memory. Late nights. Books she couldn't afford. Classes she had to leave. Opportunities that had slipped through her fingers. Not because she wasn't capable, but because she didn't have a choice. I guess, she hesitated, then continued. I'm tired of pretending I don't see things. Silence. This time, it felt heavier. More real. Daniel didn't respond immediately, but something shifted in his eyes. Something subtle. Like a calculation had just been updated. Across the room, a waiter passed by, carrying a tray identical to the one Emily had just set down. For a second, she watched him. The familiarity of it. The simplicity. The safety. That had been her world. Predictable. Controlled. Understandable. And now, she was sitting here, across from a man who operated in a completely different reality. One where decisions moved millions of dollars. Where mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they were costly. Where people like her didn't usually get invited to stay. You're thinking about leaving. Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts. Emily blinked. What? You reached for your tray earlier, he said. Twice. A small pause. People do that when they're trying to return to something familiar. Emily didn't realize he had noticed. But of course he had. He noticed everything. I should go back to work, she said. The words came out softer this time. Less certain. Daniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively, but enough to close the distance between them. Do you want to? He asked. The question caught her off guard. Because no one had asked her that before. Not like this. Not in a way that made the answer matter. Emily hesitated. Her instinct was to say yes. To return to what was safe. What was known. But something held her back. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure. I don't know, she admitted. And that honesty surprised even her. Daniel nodded slowly, as if that answer told him more than anything else she could have said. Good, he said. Emily frowned slightly. Good. People who are too certain, he said, usually aren't paying attention. A beat. You are. Silence settled again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, like something was building beneath the surface. Unspoken. Waiting. Then Daniel reached for the folder on the table. Closed it. Not abruptly. Deliberately. The deal was done. But something else had just begun. You said you couldn't afford to finish school, he said. Emily nodded. Yes. How long would it take you to get back? The question felt sudden. Direct. Too direct. I haven't thought about it, she said honestly. That's not what I asked. Emily paused. Then, more carefully, a year. Maybe less. Daniel held her gaze. Then nodded once. Like he had just confirmed something. Come to my office tomorrow, he said. The words landed differently this time. Not just as an opportunity, but as a decision. Emily felt her heartbeat pick up again. Why? She asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. Because I don't think you belong here. The words hit harder than she expected. Her expression tightened slightly. That's not. In this role, he clarified calmly. A pause. You're underused. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest shifting into something she couldn't quite name. Hope. Fear. Maybe both. And what happens if I say no? She asked. Daniel leaned back, completely at ease again. Then nothing changes, he said. Simple. Direct. You go back to work. You finish your shift. And this becomes a story you tell yourself about what could have been. Silence. That line stayed. Because it wasn't pressure. It was truth. And truth was harder to ignore. Emily looked at the table. At the empty glass. At the reflection staring back at her. Then slowly, she looked back up. At him. And if I say yes? Daniel's expression didn't change. But his eyes sharpened slightly. Then we find out what you're actually capable of. A pause. And then, the smallest hint of something else. Not quite a smile. But close. And I have a feeling, he added. It's more than this room can contain. Emily didn't answer immediately. But this time, she didn't reach for the tray. A pause. And in that pause, something shifted again. Emily felt it. This wasn't about what just happened anymore. This was about what came next. The air between them changed. Not louder. Not tense. Just heavier. Like something unspoken had settled into place. Waiting. Emily felt it before she understood it. The way Daniel was looking at her now, not as part of the situation, but separate from it, as someone worth considering. She shifted slightly in her chair, suddenly aware of everything again. Her uniform. The crease in her sleeve. The distance between her and this world. I should get back to work, she said. Soft. Automatic. A reflex. A way out. Back to something safe. Something known. Daniel didn't move. No, one word. Clean. Final. Emily blinked, caught off guard by how fast, and how certain, he answered. Before she could respond, her manager stepped in. Finally. Miss Hayes, he said, his smile tight, controlled. We have other tables waiting. Polite, but strained. This had gone too far. Emily started to stand. Part of her relieved. Part of her unsure. But Daniel spoke again. She's not returning to the floor. No raised voice. No emotion. Just fact. The manager froze. Sir, with all due respect, she is an employee here. Daniel reached into his jacket, pulled out a simple black card, placed it on the table, slowly, deliberately. And now, he said, she's under my consideration. Silence. The manager's eyes dropped to the card. Recognition hit instantly. Then hesitation. Then calculation. And finally, nothing. He stepped back, retreated. The situation had moved beyond him. Emily was still half standing, caught between two directions. Two lives. Sit. Daniel said again, softer this time, but no less firm. She sat, slowly. When the manager was out of earshot, Daniel turned back to her. You said you left because you couldn't afford to finish, he said. How far did you get? Emily hesitated. Her fingers brushed lightly against her notebook again, grounding herself. 2 years, she said. I was working part-time, but tuition went up. I couldn't keep up. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it. And since then, Emily exhaled softly. I kept studying on my own, she admitted. Listening, practicing, writing things down. A small pause. It's not the same, but it's something. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to her apron, to the notebook, then back to her. It's more than something, he said. No exaggeration, no praise, just truth. Emily felt something shift in her chest, something unfamiliar. Being seen, really seen. But that came with risk. Because if this was real, everything could change. Daniel leaned back slightly, decision already forming. You're wasting your time here, he said. Not harsh, just accurate. Emily's reaction came instantly. I need this job, she said. Too fast, too real. It pays my rent. It keeps things stable. Daniel didn't flinch. Stability isn't the same as staying stuck. The words landed deeper than anything else. Quieter, but harder to ignore. Emily didn't answer, because part of her agreed, and part of her was afraid he was right. Daniel watched her for a moment, then reached for his phone. Decision made. You're coming to my office tomorrow. A beat. 10 a.m. Not a question, not a suggestion, a direction. Emily sat there, silent, because this time, she didn't say no. The city felt different that night. Or maybe she did. When Emily stepped out of the restaurant, the lights seemed harsher, sharper, like everything had shifted slightly out of place and hadn't settled back yet. The cool air brushed against her face, grounding her just enough to realize this was real. In her hand, the folded piece of paper felt heavier than it should. An address, written in clean, precise handwriting. 10 a.m. It echoed in her mind louder than the traffic rushing past. She should have said no. That thought came back again and again. Logical. Safe. She had a job. It wasn't perfect, but it paid the rent. It kept things stable. Walking into a billionaire's office with no degree, no resume, no guarantees, that wasn't stability. That was risk. And risk had never been kind to her. She started walking. Familiar streets. Familiar noise. People moving fast, each one carrying their own invisible weight. Normally, that anonymity comforted her. Tonight, it didn't. Everything felt louder, sharper. The moment replayed in her head. Her voice, the silence, the way Daniel had looked at her, not dismissing her, not doubting her, seeing her. That was the part that stayed. When she reached her building, she paused. The flickering hallway light inside reflected faintly on the glass door. This was her world. Small, predictable, safe, with limits she had learned not to question. Her hand slipped into her apron pocket. The notebook. She opened it. Pages filled with words. Translations. Late-night notes from a version of herself she wasn't sure still existed. Her fingers traced a line she had written weeks ago. Proof. She hadn't completely let go. Staying stuck, she whispered. This time, it didn't feel like an insult. It felt like truth. Inside her apartment, the silence wrapped around her. The hum of an old fridge. Footsteps above. The same life. Unchanged. She sat on the edge of her bed, the paper still in her hand. 10 a.m. Her eyes drifted to the clock. 11:42 p.m. Less than 11 hours. Enough time to decide. Or not enough at all. She lay back, staring at the ceiling. If she didn't go, nothing would change. Same job. Same routine. Same quiet voice telling her she could have done more. But if she did go, everything could change. The thought scared her. But it didn't let go. Her phone buzzed. A message from her manager. Tomorrow's shift schedule. Her name still there. Like nothing had happened. Like tonight hadn't cracked something open. Emily stared at the screen, then slowly set the phone down. She looked back at the paper. 10 a.m. This time, she didn't argue, didn't overthink, didn't hesitate. She made a decision, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like movement. Forward. The next morning didn't feel normal. It felt like the moment before something irreversible. Quiet, but heavy. Emily stood outside the glass building, her reflection faintly staring back at her, distorted slightly by height, by scale, by everything this place represented. She checked the paper again. Same address. No mistake. Carter Enterprises. The name stretched across the entrance in steel letters. Clean. Simple. Powerful. People moved in and out with purpose. Sharp suits. Confident steps. No hesitation. Emily adjusted her bag, suddenly aware of everything. Her clothes. Her posture. The fact that she didn't look like she belonged here. Doubt crept in again. Soft. Dangerous. You can still walk away. No one's forcing you. But then, she remembered the night before. The silence. The shift. The decision. She stepped forward. Inside, the lobby was overwhelming. High ceilings. Marble floors. Sunlight cutting through glass. Everything felt intentional. Controlled. Can I help you? The receptionist's voice pulled her back. Emily hesitated, just a fraction. I have a meeting with Daniel Carter. 10 a.m. A small pause. The receptionist's expression shifted. Not disbelief. Adjustment. She typed quickly, then nodded. He's expecting you. Those words hit differently. Expecting you. Not questioning. Not verifying. Expecting. Something inside Emily shifted. Subtle, but real. She was handed a badge, directed to the elevator. The ride up felt longer than it was. Each floor lighting up, one by one. The city shrinking below. By the time the doors opened, her heartbeat had steadied. Not calm, but controlled. A man in a tailored suit waited. Emily Hayes. Not a question. This way. She followed. Glass offices. Focused people. Everything moving with intention. They stopped at a set of doors. He's inside. Emily paused, just for a second, then pushed the door open. The office was quiet. Spacious. Minimal. Control, not display. Daniel stood by the window, looking out over the city, like it belonged to him. He turned. Their eyes met. Same look as last night. Focus. Recognition. You came. Not surprise. Confirmation. Emily stepped inside. The door closed behind her, sealing everything else out. You said 10 a.m., she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. Daniel nodded. Sit. This time, she didn't hesitate. Emily sat down. This time, the chair didn't feel wrong, just new, like something she hadn't grown into yet. The city stretched behind Daniel, glass and steel catching the light, everything moving below. But inside this room, time slowed. Focused. Deliberate. Daniel sat across from her, hands resting lightly on the desk. Relaxed. Precise. For a moment, silence. Not awkward. Not empty. Just wait. Then, before anything else, he said, I need to know something. Emily met his gaze. No hesitation now. Why did you speak up? Simple question. But it cut deeper than anything else. Emily didn't answer immediately. Her fingers brushed her notebook inside her bag, grounding herself. Because it was wrong, she said. A pause. And I understood it. Another beat. And if I stayed silent, I would have known I let it happen. Daniel watched her, not just listening, measuring. Then, a small nod. Good. He pulled a folder forward, opened it, turned it toward her. Documents. Structured. Serious. This is a provisional position, he said. Language and negotiation support. Directly under my team. Emily blinked, her mind catching up. You're offering me a job. Daniel leaned back slightly. I'm offering you an opportunity, he corrected. The job depends on what you do with it. Emily felt it. The weight. The shift. This wasn't just work. This was a different path. I don't have a degree, she said. Automatic. I don't have formal experience. Daniel didn't hesitate. You have something more valuable. A beat. You listen when others assumed. You spoke when it mattered. And you were right. Silence. Emily looked down at the papers, then back at him. And if I fail? Daniel's expression didn't change. Then you learn. Simple. And you try again. Emily exhaled slowly. Something inside her shifted. Fear, turning into something else. She reached for the pen, paused, just for a second, then signed. The moment was small, but everything changed. She looked up. Daniel was watching her. Not surprised. Not impressed. Expecting. Welcome to Carter Enterprises, Emily. And just like that, the distance between who she was and who she could become didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt like a beginning. Daniel closed the folder, but didn't move it away. Instead, he slid another file across the desk. Thicker. More serious. Your first assignment, he said. Emily frowned slightly. What is it? Daniel held her gaze. Calm. Unreadable. A deal, he said. A pause. With the same investor. Emily's breath caught. Daniel continued. And this time, someone doesn't want it to go through. Silence. Then, you're going to find out why.